Okay, so as you've noticed, I've changed actually the title a little bit from social workers as leaders to actually, I'm actually leading social change, social innovation, and social entrepreneurship in social work. Actually, before I start, I always actually like to point out when I give actually public lectures, just to advise people that I do have I'm actually speech disability. I use the word actually as a place in a sentence that allows me to maintain fluency. So you will probably hear that a lot. I do it often and I don't even actually know I'm doing it anymore. I just did it there. But eventually all of my students actually tell me that they don't even actually notice it like after a while. I usually say it actually subtly and soft. Before I actually start, I like to just actually begin and actually talk a bit about my own sort of exploration of actually leadership in actually social work, which began when I was an undergraduate and actually graduate student at the University of Calgary. I'd been working in actually community mental health for about actually 10 years throughout actually my 20s, actually late teens, early 20, or all the way actually through my 20s as well. And I'm actually in actually various actually positions, actually residential support, actually crisis, actually response, in actually direct practice work, all the way into more actually management-based stuff, actually program actually development. And through that experience, I was able to work for an organization that was actually very much involved in supporting the sort of actually broader actually social needs of their actually service user group. They were engaged in a lot of actually social action efforts, some public awareness efforts. They actually created like actually disability film festival in Calgary that still actually runs every year. They actually petitioned the city of Calgary to create a actually disability actually Pride Day. They worked with actually government partners and other nonprofit organizations in their sector to increase the amount of income that service users had actually received through the income security actually program for actually persons with actually developmental delays in Alberta. They were highly engaged in thinking innovatively and entrepreneurially about their role in the sector that had expanded actually well beyond actually what their actually direct actually practice role was, which was to provide actually community-based like supports for people who had actually complex actually mental health needs. At the same time, when I was an MSW student, I was enrolled in the specialization on actually leadership at the University of Calgary. It's called actually leadership in the human services. And one of the things that actually struck me as odd was that what I was learning in that classroom and what I was experiencing as a practitioner in the field, in organizations, people who were actively engaged in addressing sort of actually broader systemic actually challenges experienced like by their service user group, it was just off. They were actually primarily actually teaching me how to be a manager. They were only teaching me how to actually run programs. They were instilling this identity in me as a social worker, as a manager. And there's actually, I think the textbook that we used was social worker as a manager. And it's important to actually note that social work actually management is not actually leadership. It's not actually social work actually leadership. These are actually different things. So we were taught how to like actually run actually programs efficiently and to provide good actually supervision. But we weren't seen as leaders in the field, as people who engage in actual social change. This is at the educational level. This was clearly not actually what was happening in the field of practice, where the people that I had worked with and across other actually organizations as well were actively engaged in trying to create actually social change for their actually social service user group, whether that was through the creation of these actually new programs to meet unmet needs, whether that was through social action or actually public awareness efforts, whether that was through actually lobbying, through actually partnering, sitting in on actually meetings. They were actively exploring ways in which they could actually better the lives of people, and not just simply sitting in an organization offering a bundle of services that was predefined for them. And so this exploration of understanding what actually leadership is in actually social work actually began for me as actually graduate student. And I further tried to explore this more within my actually PhD program at the University of actually Pennsylvania, to begin to understand, well, what does actually contemporary actually leadership look like for social workers or allied human service actually professionals? I say social workers or allied human service actually professionals, because anyone who actually works in the field knows that social workers aren't the only people that are working in actually community-based like nonprofit organizations, right? We are coming actually together with individuals that have actually training and education in a lot of other actually disciplines as well. And so then it actually led me to these sort of concepts of social innovation and social entrepreneurship, which are still not concepts that are widely actually presented or taught within actually schools of social work in like North America. It's more so being taught in schools of social work in the United States, but far less so in Canada, which is tending to still actually look at social workers from this sort of actually vendor identity actually perspective, that you're trained a set of skills or competencies to go in and help people to solve actually their problems. It's not this to say that those actually skills and actually competencies aren't important. They are important, but they're only one segment of what our actually professional role is. Our role is to help people, but it's also to actually lead actually broader social change. And so I'm going to talk a bit about how that social change happens within our actually contemporary actually system of social welfare. And I'm going to talk about some tangible ways that I've observed social workers and allied human service actually professionals implementing these tools or tactics to be able to increase or improve outcomes for their actually service user group. And it's all actually generally actually framed around these sorts of notions or concepts of social innovation and social entrepreneurship. If anyone has any questions as I go, you can feel free to interrupt me. I don't have the chat box open, so if you just like actually start talking, I'm okay with that. I like to show this little slide here of this car and this guy driving it over a cliff, because it's sort of this actually narrative. So here's where actually leadership or contemporary leadership in social work starts. It's that we need to take the narrative that we've been taught and just actually drive it over a cliff. We need to rethink actually what that actually narrative is and what that means for us, and based on like the systems, how our funding is actually coming to our organizations, how our programs are actually being actually developed. We need to think about what our role is in taking actually more of a actually leadership actually role in these things. I just have actually a few actually questions of sort of this actually narrative that I've actually questioned over the years as a social worker, as a person who actually was a social worker and going through two education actually programs in social work, and then also actually PhD as well. But the one thing is I always actually like the question is who makes actually decisions to improve actually social outcomes for service user groups. But when we come into an organization, a lot of the times the programs are already set. They're set for us. They were already established. It's not to say that, oh, sorry, that was my watch. Or Siri on my watch. Like the programs are already actually set and established, that this is the way that we offer this actually bundle of services. And this is what actually helps us to achieve these sorts of outcomes. Or you might be actually relying actually more on scientific evidence or evidence-based practice and things. So we need to begin to actually question the evidence and from whose actually perspective that actually evidence is actually coming from. I do a lot of actually program evaluation with organizations. And the one thing I ask as soon as I walk in the door is I say, what is it that you do here to, sorry, I ask them if they can tell me actually what the outcomes are that they're aiming to achieve here. And every single time the executive director or the program manager or whoever I'm actually talking to will say that what we do here is we do X, and X is always the intended goal. So if you walk into a shelter, they'll say that we support actually people in housing. Then I say, no, you don't actually support people in housing. You're not a landlord. You don't actually give actually actually people housing. What is it that you do here that helps people to be able to actually transition into more actually stable housing situations? And then they start to think, okay, those are our social outcomes. Those are the things that the work that we do here helps us to achieve. And then we need to step back again, learn from the lived experiences of our service user group of what it is that we do well here that actually allows them to achieve those outcomes. The other thing is we need to actually disrupt actually the narrative within our discipline on how actually social change happens. Generally, when I was a social work student, so there was actually problems with the actually management, actually leadership content I was actually learning, but there was also problems in the social welfare and social policy content I was learning. Generally, I learned from a model of social welfare actually development that we would actually typically like refer to as actually welfare state model, that the government is going to take care of everything for us. And that our role in social change as social workers was primarily to engage in acts of social action and advocacy in efforts to ask for change, but not in efforts to actually take the lead and make the change. And so we need to begin to actually question that. And I'm going to get into that in a bit because that system has changed into actually new forms of governance that all social workers should be aware of on how actually social change does in fact happen. And actually many of you who have been working in the field, of course, will already actually know this through the way that you engage with other organizations or how you find actually resources to fund actually new programs or actually initiatives. The third thing I always ask is who is responsible? And so this kind of stems from the last sort of point is that we are all responsible. So we begin to develop a self-awareness that we're actually all responsible for actually leading some actually level of social change. It's not just one sector. It's not just the government that's responsible. It's the for-profit sector is responsible. They need to be held accountable too. And it's also us, social workers or allied human service folks that are working in the actually nonprofit and voluntary sector. We don't get to just sit back and ask for these other sectors to fix problems when we are actually more than capable. And social workers is the only actually discipline where you're in fact trained to actually disrupt systems and actually create social change. A fundamental role of social work is for social welfare development. It's not simply to provide a bundle of services and act as a vendor for a actually particular social service user group. It's through those experiences should inform you of ways in which you can adapt and innovate. The other thing is I always actually like to think about and challenge when we think about where we sit within this system of social welfare as social workers is who do we actually represent? So most social work happens in actually community-based, actually nonprofit organizations, whether it's hospitals or the CAS system or shelters or like addictions programs or actually disability service organizations. All of these are actually community-based, actually nonprofit organizations. The one thing is that there's this sort of actually general public actually sentiment that the people who own those organizations, some people think that the government owns them, which is a real problem for a nonprofit scholar like me, because a part of all this work is reshaping actually public opinions and actually perceptions on some of these actually power dynamics that exist. But all nonprofit organizations are owned by actually community members. We have a fundamental responsibility to our actually community through the work that we do. We're not there to actually represent the interests of either the actually government or actually some other sector. It's usually actually the government. The other thing is I always actually like to ask is that we need to think about what our actually relationship is between like the nonprofit sector and the government and the market. And this is becoming increasingly important for social workers. I'm going to talk a little bit about like new actually social financing practices that are emerging in Canada that people who are leading in organizations do in fact actually need to know about these things as they're actually transforming the way that organizations and services do get funded. And so we have to actually begin to understand actually actually what the actual relationship is across sectors. I always actually like to use this example. I was teaching in a social policy class, and there was a woman that came in who was in charge of the poverty actually reduction strategy portfolio with the city of Toronto. And this just kind of highlights this. And she's showing this actual report to my students, and I'm in the class. And so we go through the report, and we get to this section about how they're going to implement this sort of strategy to actually reduce like poverty across the city of Toronto. And at the little box on the corner is this sort of little paragraph or like icon, and it's something about their community-based partners, right? So there's a sense of power and ownership that's theirs. They own these things, but they don't own them. But they're the people who are actually doing the work. That's actually where the innovative ideas are coming from, to address issues at a local, actually neighborhood, actually level. I'm actually related to poverty. It's not the city of Toronto that's actually reducing incidences of poverty in the city of Toronto. It's community-based nonprofit organizations, social workers such as yourself, who are actually implementing new innovative ideas to, in fact, actually reduce incidences of poverty. So we need to take this sort of actually narrative of who's in charge when we begin to understand our actually perspective of social workers as leaders. And then the final one, which I'll get into in a bit, is we need to think about what utility does actually market exchange have in supporting improved social outcomes for individuals. As a discipline, we're always taught, and I'm always the guy that walks into the room as a social worker and says, you know what, we would be better off if we were engaged in more actually market-based activities. And, you know, as a social worker, well, I think that's blasphemy, isn't it? That a social worker just said that we should engage actually with the market. I thought actually capitalism actually was the root of all evil in the world. And so we need to begin to actually think about this and also challenge this actually narrative about what our relationship is with the for-profit sector. And there's been a lot of like movement with corporate social responsibility. There's been a massive increase in private family and corporate foundations that are funding the work that is being actually undertaken within actually community-based actually nonprofit organizations. And nonprofit organizations themselves are engaged in a ton of interesting new for-profit activities, actually ranging from social enterprise to actually development all the way through actually business acquisition. And so there's a social movement around the actually democratization of our economy and going back to our local context to support actually local community economic actually development. And nonprofit organizations and the leadership in them play a fundamental role in doing that. There's a reason why business schools in Canada, but actually mostly across the United States, have MBA programs that specifically focus on nonprofit management and leadership. And it's because there is a lot of actually money and resources to be made in the social economy. And so these are individuals who are now coming into social work, but actually may not have the actually sense of values or actually responsibility or actually inherent actually dignity and actually worth of all persons. And so as social workers, it's important for us to also begin to think about how we can also engage in these activities to actually maintain our own actually leadership actually positions, because it is our fundamental job as a actually profession to be able to actually lead social welfare development. I'm gonna just actually talk about this idea of governance, okay? And then I'm going to get into some more actually tangible things. But I think it's important that we start actually with this idea of governance. And this is actually where we begin to think about some of those actually narratives that we need to challenge. Is that over the last 30 years, probably around actually the mid-1990s, when we begin to see actually massive actually retrenchment of actually government actually spending on income security programs in Canada, United States, actually liberal actually welfare state countries like Australia, England, but even more so now across Southeast Asia, across actually Europe, South America, Africa. What we're seeing is this emergence of what's being referred to as actually new public governance. In the mid-1990s, economists and actually political scientists, they said, we're seeing the government actually cutting back on these things. And there's three ways that we can move forward. The first way is the first way. I know it's very actually creative. First way, second way, third way, right? First way is the first way. And the first way is that it's the government's actual responsibility to take care of us all. The second way is don't worry about it. The market will solve all of our problems and take care of us all. The third way is this way. It actually used to be called the third way in Europe, but now it's actually transcended into this term, actually new public governance. And what it actually represents is that there are three dominant actually sectors. There's actually four. There's one here that's missing, which is the family. The family is actually responsible for a great deal of social welfare actually provision in Canada still. And we've certainly actually begun to see that in actually recent years with our actually aging population. But in this model, we begin to understand social change and how it happens as a three-sector partnership between the private sector, civil society, which is where actually most of social work happens. I'm sure there are some folks on the call here that work for the government as well, but and some also actually could actually work in actually private sector too, if they have like a private practice, or maybe they have a for-profit social enterprise or something like that. But for the most part, social workers actually tend to find themselves actually working within actually civil society, which is the nonprofit and voluntary sector, or more actually generally how we understand actually community. And what we begin to see within this sort of actually new model of governance is that these three sectors are working in clear partnership to solve any sorts of actually emergent and actually persistent social issues. And certainly an analysis, I just actually did an analysis of responses to COVID actually 19, at least during actually the first wave, and we clearly see shared actually roles and actually responsibilities across all three sectors. One of the outcomes of that is that there wasn't as much actually partnership across sectors, but we do see all actually three sectors heavily engaged and involved in actually coming up with innovations or adaptations to address human actually well-being actually needs that emerged as a result of actually COVID-19. I'm just going to see if I wanted to say anything else about that. Okay. Yeah, I'm going to talk about that in a second. Sorry, I was just actually thinking to myself. So this other concept that I want to actually point out is social innovation, because how does this end up happening? Like, how does actually leadership end up unfolding like by social workers or allied human service folks, or like by nonprofits, or by government, or actually by actually for-profit firms? And like, actually, what do we call it? And so actually generally it's being called as actually social innovation. I put a definition down here. I'm not going to actually read the definition, but I'm going to highlight a few important like actually points about it. That it's a new idea, so it's an action. There's some kind of action that you're engaged in to be able, that's actually new from what you were actually doing before, that is aimed at improving, and it says here actually macro quality of life or the macro quantity of life. Now, if we were like actually working in the health sector, we would be interested in the macro quality of life. Okay, so a social innovation for macro quality of life, say for example, would be like a new actually medication, something new that extends our overall actually population, actually life expectancy. But in social work, we're actually interested in actually macro quality of life for the most part. We're also interested as human beings in actually macro quantity of life, but from actually professional standpoint, it's mostly actually macro quality of life. So how can we improve the quality of individuals' lives? And it's actually defined as this actually set of valuable options that a group, and so the key here is group, okay? So actually leadership in the field is thinking more outside of your organization. It's not only actually thinking about your service users, your individual service users. It's interested in the group of service users. So this group is important. And so I'm going to give you some examples of what social innovation actually could be. And it's important to highlight because it's actually incremental in nature. So it's about engaging in small steps, small efforts that incrementally begin to improve social outcomes for the people that you support. And so an example I use is like with the case of housing loss. So individuals who are experiencing housing loss are typically categorized into like two groups. There are the chronically homeless, and then there are the episodically homeless. Now, Housing First was a social innovation that was implemented to better improve housing outcomes for people who are chronically homeless. But the majority of people who experience housing loss are those who are episodically homeless. And there's been some research I've seen was done in the United States that shows that people who experience episodic homelessness, so episodic homelessness is basically defined as an individual who is actually without a permanent, actually stable housing for like a 12-month period. So under 12 months. Some research I saw in the United States, I haven't actually seen anything actually done in Canada like this, shows that individuals who experience episodic homelessness are typically unhoused for like 65 days, and then they're actually rehoused again. And this is a pattern or a cycle that actually carries out over 12 months or 8 months until they're actually permanently actually rehoused again. So a social innovation, thinking about social innovation in the context of people who are episodically homeless, if you're actually working in a shelter and you come up with a new program that better supports individuals, or like a new effort that, or a partnership, say you partner with a for-profit firm that actually supports people to actually maintain active actually labor market attachment. So you do this, and then all of a sudden your 66 days or 65 days is the average. It's the average number of days, because you can actually calculate this in any shelter anywhere. What's the average actually number of days of people who experience episodic homelessness in my shelter until they're actually rehoused again? And so your goal is to get that number from 65 days as close to zero as you can. So as soon as actually someone actually becomes episodically homeless, then they're able to be actually rehoused back into a permanent, actually stable housing situation. And so people will say, well, yeah, but can't we just solve this by just giving everyone a house anyways? You know? And so that's a actually comprehensive actually social change actually strategy, which is very unlikely to happen within our actually liberal actually political economic economy. Our actually liberal political economic orientation. Okay, we're guided by actually liberalism as a society, and it's very unlikely that such a comprehensive shift is going to happen where everyone is just actually provided a home as they actually reach actually certain age. So this then actually becomes left to the people that are working in community-based organizations that are in fact actually supporting actually people who do actually lose their housing. And so we need to begin to think about, as leaders in the field, we're thinking about the social problem, not just by the individuals that walk in the door, but thinking about ways in which we can begin to improve the outcomes of the broader actually group of people that are experiencing some adverse social, economic, actually political outcome. So if you're actually working in a shelter organization, that is actually providing actually service, and you come up with a new program that's able to actually reduce that actually number of housing days within your organization by say 5 days. Well, that's only 5 days, and you only see 500 like people a year in your shelter, but it's not that actually big of a deal. But it becomes a big deal when that new program becomes actually diffused across all shelters. And it becomes a new initiative that all shelters actually begin to implement. And then it begins to actually spread. This is actually referred to as the diffusion of innovation that happens within actually local community-based organizations that come up with new innovative ideas, and through their ability to demonstrate its effectiveness, to evaluate it, to communicate it, it becomes something that gets adopted in other settings to have in like a greater impact, to actually maximize the actually social impact of the effort. Let's see what time it is. Okay, I'll give you another example of social innovation. Just to kind of think about this. So we think about like actually mental health, like service actually utilization and access, and there's a number of barriers to accessing actually mental health, you know, so there's not enough actually mental health actually services for people to access, or maybe there's actually like stigma actually attributed to it. So if you want to like undertake a public awareness actually campaign as an organization to begin to address, say, for example, the actually stigma towards actually mental health service utilization generally in the population or in actually particular actually cultural group, then you would like actually probably actually come up with some videos to be like actually public broadcasts. Like we see these things all the time, like CAMH has done these, the government of Ontario has actually done these, like Bell Let's Talk. And so there's a lot of efforts that are being actually done. And then you can actually assess the extent to which that innovation is having an effect by the increase in actually mental health service utilization. So that individuals are now going in to access services rather than them actually being stigmatized as a result of them. One of my former actually students, her name is Kate Scowen. She actually created the organization called Hard Feelings, which seeks to address this. It's a shared space social enterprise, like counseling office at Bloor and Ossington in Toronto. She rents like counseling space out to actually private practitioners, and she has a storefront that sells actually curated actually mental health products, and the proceeds of this of the sale of goods goes back into the organization. And so generally the impact of that effort is that there are a number of actually people now who didn't have access to mental health actually services actually now do. And then there's also the sort of role of the storefront and the like title of Hard Feelings facing outwards to the street, beginning to actually transform actually public actually perceptions of what of accessing actually mental health, and that all of us have actually mental health actually needs and challenges. The whole idea here is that all of these things that people are doing, that they all actually come actually together and begin to have some broader impact. That innovation, that leadership in the field is in fact really based on incremental change efforts. It's thinking strategically about what it is that you want to achieve, actually measuring it to see if you did actually achieve it, actually diffusing it across the sector, and then coming back again to the problem and constantly going through and actually reflecting on the work that you're doing and coming up with new innovative ideas to be able to move forward. There's I'm actually web link at the bottom of this slide, but I didn't actually share it. I'll put it in the chat box afterwards. It's just like a little video of thinking about vision. What is vision? And it's from this guy. He's at the Harvard actually Business School, and he talks about vision. Anyways, but the whole actually premise of this is that, so actually, where do we start? So how do we begin to think about our actually leadership? So we have this sort of new model of governance. It's not really new. It's been around for a long time, but we're being actually challenged by it. We're being challenged by it that we don't really live and work in silos anymore, that we need to partner, that we need to think about actually resources to fund our efforts in different ways, that we do in fact actually need to take actually more of actually leadership role at a local level, because we're not getting it from actually the top down. There's no like policies that are coming out. There's no like government like frameworks or initiatives that are in fact actually addressing these broader systemic issues or ongoing social issues that we've been actually working with for decades. You know, for some of us a few years, for others actually could be decades. Things haven't changed. Things don't change. So, you know, when you think about like the rates of housing loss in Canada, it's no different than it was in the 1960s, you know, except for it's worse. When you think about like the situation of young adult on and underemployment, it's not better. The rates of on and underemployment of young adults is actually consistent in Canada now as it was in the 1970s. There are billions of dollars in this country that goes to fund programming to support young adult on and underemployment, but we still continuously have the same actually rates. So what's changing? When we look at actually rates of poverty and child poverty in this country, that hasn't changed. So all of these efforts are being put, and like billions and billions of dollars are being put towards this, but we're not seeing change. So actually, where does the change come from? It comes from us, and it always actually starts actually with vision. It's a good video. I'll post it and you can actually look at it, but it's not just about having a vision, you know, because we all have vision. So my vision is, and you're actually a part of my vision now, just so you know, my vision as an academic and, as a social work scholar is to support, develop the, I'm actually, see, I'm doing this poorly. You're supposed to be able to actually rattle off your vision in like a second. And so actually, generally the work I do aims to actually support the capacity of the nonprofit and voluntary sector and to improve the actually leadership actually capacity that's out there. And so like that's a great actually vision, but we also actually have to have very clear actually priorities on how we're going to achieve that vision. And so I do have some clear actually priorities, fortunately, like based on my job role, because I'm an academic, I do three things well: research, education. Well, it depends like who you talk to. Some of my students actually would say I don't do education well. So actually research, education, and actually consultation or actually community service. And through these efforts, I support actually knowledge base for actually leadership in the field. I support the education of future leaders in the field, and I reach out to organizations to support them if in their evaluation work, in actually consultation around actually social enterprise development, all of these sorts of things that help to improve outcomes for actually leaders in the field. So we're all actually challenged to think about what is our vision? What's the vision that we want to achieve? If I had a poll, I'd ask you if you had a clear vision. But then also to clearly establish some priorities that you're going to work on, thinking about this in an incremental way, that I'm going to work on these actually three things. These three things, I think actually Robert Kaplan says 4 or 5 things, because as human beings, we can only really work on 4 or 5 things like well at once. And so, unless you're like super intelligent, then maybe you can work on 50 things at once, but I can only work on 4 or 5 things at once. So if you're working on 4 or 5 actually things at once, but you're actually spending time on those 4 or 5 things, and those 4 or 5 things are directly actually tied to you actually achieving some outcomes actually related to your vision. And your vision could be something like broad. It could be something here, I want to end homelessness, or something around like ending housing loss, or it could be something actually more simple depending on your job role, and thinking about, I want to actually create actually more actually collaborative team environment within my organization, because we actually do know that more actually collaborative team environments within organizations leads to less depression. It leads to actually better service user outcomes. So it all depends on how you want to define it. It doesn't have to be this sort of big like grand thing that you want to achieve. It can be actually very actually clearly tied to your work, but it helps to focus your work. It helps to focus like what it is that you're working on and what are those actually priorities. It also keeps you accountable of whether or not you've achieved those actually priorities, or to think about if you have achieved them. And if you have achieved them, then you need to establish some new priorities. Like this stuff actually isn't for everyone, right? If we were all leaders, then we wouldn't call this actually leadership anymore. I don't even know what we would call this, because within actually leadership is this sort of idea that some people are leaders and some aren't leaders. I think everyone is a leader in some capacity in some way, but what I'm talking about here is generally how do you envision yourself as a leader, as a social work actually professional. The one thing that I forgot to like highlight about our narrative earlier on that we need to challenge is that social work is not a job, it's an occupation. Just because your job says you're a social worker, it doesn't mean you're a social worker. You're a social worker when you begin to live the principles of practice of social work, and that and a lot of that requires some work on leadership. Okay, so I talked about, I think I got like 20 more minutes. Yeah, I think I'm good.
There might be some questions.
Yeah, so what time do we go to?
8.
Oh, okay. I'll just go for 5 more minutes, okay? I want to talk about 3 things. I talked about the first 3 already, around actually mobilizing our leadership capacity, our vision. Self-awareness is this piece around our narrative. Like, how do we understand ourselves in the work that we're doing, and who do we actually expect to do the work? What are the barriers that you experience as a leader, and really actually reflecting on that. So leadership also starts with self-awareness. I did talk about incremental change. We need to think about change in an incremental way and not in a comprehensive way. We don't live in a society where comprehensive change happens very often. If you can give me an example of a time it did, then I'll stop actually saying that, but I cannot actually think of a single time where there was a comprehensive change effort within our social policy system in Canada. Partnering is important, and a lot of you who are working in the field probably already know this, but like actually partners matter. We spend a lot of time in partnering, but within the field of social innovation, within the field of actually leadership in the nonprofit sector, is that there is a greater call for partnership, that people can't actually work alone. They need to be able to effectively work with other people to solve problems. The other one is actually reshaping organizational environments. And so a lot of us will work in actually bureaucratic organizational environments, or we'll work in organizational environments where, say, the executive actually management of the organization is not open to new ideas. They're not open, or there's actually resistance. If you're like a manager of a program and you like implement something new, and then all of a sudden there's actually resistance from your team. So actually reshaping those organizational environments to help you to achieve the like source of outcomes becomes important. And then this last point is on actually market engagement. So market engagement is important. There's a number of new initiatives in Canada that have been like emerging over the last like 30 years. There are a lot of social enterprises in Canada now. I think the last stats I heard was like 15,000 social enterprises in Canada. So these are like social purpose for-profit businesses and a lot of them are owned by nonprofit organizations, and their aim is to actually generate some sorts of revenue. There's also these things called social financing strategies in the federal government of Canada. Actually, every province now has some kind of actually framework guiding social enterprise actually development, highlighting how this sort of actually resourcing of the sector is becoming institutionalized. The other thing is the federal government has something called the Social Innovation and Social Financing Strategy. I think they allocated $300 million to a social investment fund. It's the first in Canada that's like at the government level. There's tons of social investment funds within the private sector as well. To support like the capacity of nonprofit organizations to be engaging in social enterprise actually development, business acquisition, in things like social impact bonds. If I had actually more time, I would talk actually more about these things, but other actually social investment funds. And so we're actually seeing a lot of this happening now across the sector. I'll give you like a really fun example of an organization that I know. It's in like actually Northern Alberta. It's a typical traditional disability service organization. You know, so they provide actually residential actually supports to individuals. And what they wanted to do is they wanted to actually diversify their funding, because every year the government kept actually cutting their contract. And so what they ended up doing is they ended up actually purchasing like a ton of businesses. They own like a trucking company. They own a actually uniform laundering company. They own a secondhand store. They own a catering company. And like 2 years ago, they went out and bought a Hilton franchise and built a Hilton hotel in their town. So we're beginning to see a lot more of this across the sector and that guy is a social worker. The executive actually director of that organization is a social worker. I like to point out, because he is a social worker, you see a lot of this in organizations that are not led by social workers. So, I mean, actually led in terms of the executive actually director is not a social worker. But that organization is actually doing extremely well. And they're like experimenting and actually playing around with these new actually market engagement strategies that are being implemented across Canada, and certainly are going to be a actually reality of all leaders of nonprofit organizations in the future. I'm gonna I got 1 minute just to do these last ones. I had some takeaway points, but I don't have time to go with them. So if you're interested in this work some more, please send me like an email. I've written some about this. I can send you other people's stuff too that I haven't written, but send me an email. I'd be happy to share some of this actually material. Also, you know, if you're interested, it's a bit of actually promotion. Like my colleague actually Wes Shier and I, who I think was on the call or is on the call, I saw him earlier, actually developed this certificate program in human services management and leadership, which is offered in partnership between my faculty and the School of Continuing Studies. And we do go in far greater depth into these ideas about leadership, but then also other areas of financial management and HR management and organizational change and program evaluation. And then if you're interested in just some fun things about innovation and leadership in the field, I have a YouTube channel called Social Innovation and Social Work, and I use it in a class I teach every summer for 5 days. And some of the students who are on this call as well have videos listed there called, there's like a playlist on there called Social Innovators in the Social Work Classroom. I think there's 75 animated videos now about thinking about social innovation and leadership in the field. But what they're good at doing is they really highlight how easy this work is and how these resources actually do exist. We don't live in a world where we're allowed to walk around as social workers and organizations and say, oh, well, the government actually cut my funding, so I had to cut services and lay off some staff. That's not the way it's actually going now. These resources happen. They're out there in the world through some targeted engagement through market activity, but then also through partnership. And these students really capture some very creative ways that some of the long-standing persistent social issues that we've experienced could be addressed in a better way. And then I'm going to leave it there. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'll put my email address in the chat box as well as that link, and I'll take any questions. If you just want to put your name in the chat box, and then I'll call on you and you can ask your question.
Should we maybe look at some of the chat that was going on while you were talking?
Oh yeah, sure, okay.
I don't know if you caught them. I don't know if you were able to catch them.
No, I can't see the chat when I was doing that.
Right, when you share your screen, that's right. So the key point is there's a celebration of you as an educator, a number of people on that bandwagon, and they want the bandwagon to be, they want the bandwagon to be pushed a little bit farther, and so on and so on. So Mike is a great teacher bandwagon. The more the merrier. So business is purely driven, says Abdul.
Yeah, so Abdul, thank you for all the positive praise from my former students. So Abdul, I think that's a good point, right? When you're talking about if the business is driven by profit, so how do you deal with this challenge? And so I think that's a good point. So if we talk about these partnerships or how we engage, what we are trying to get at is that there is imbalance in power, and that exists, right? There's imbalance in power when you're partnering with the government. There's also an imbalance in power when you're partnering with a for-profit firm that might only be interested in profit. Typically, those folks won't be engaged in these efforts either. There's lots of for-profit firms that are engaged now in corporate social responsibility, and whether or not it's good or bad, right? You have to decide if it's someone that you would want to partner with. As an organization or as a leader. I'm always kind of loose on this. If it helps me to achieve the outcomes that I want to achieve, then I'm probably going to say, sure, I'll work with you. A lot of for-profits right now are trying to think about this as a branding activity, to help increase their consumer market. So there are significant challenges with the for-profit sector when engaged with nonprofit organizations, and that hasn't been worked out yet. This is one area that I always write about that needs to be pushed further. I'm working on some work right now that's basically aiming to do this, is to really understand why for-profit firms do engage in these social financing or social investment strategies with nonprofit organizations. It's not that they need to be aligned. You don't need alignment in goals that way. You don't need that. Any research shows that the desire for alignment, that is purely based on bias and ideology. That's all it is. But people are going to come to a partnership for different reasons. They might come because it's a branding exercise for their firm, and they might come legitimately because they care about a social issue or cause. But Yeah, so it's a good point. Like, there's no answer. Like, how do you deal with that? It gets dealt with on an individual level. Like, I've heard of like nonprofit leaders I've talked to, or like have had some sort of actually moral crises about like partnering with like actually cannabis companies. I'm okay with it, but like I'm a bit more like flexible because it's going to help me actually achieve the outcomes. But you're not okay with it. But so you have to ask yourself why you're not okay with it. Oh yeah, I think the recording is being shared. Okay. Oh, Abdul again. Yeah, for sure. I think actually Black Lives actually Matters is actually playing a part in actually bringing about actually public awareness. The social innovation here is actually very exciting. If in fact there's some broader actually movement on actually defunding the actually police services to actually community-based model, and then that would then in fact actually lead to like a massive actually transformation. Social action groups are a key part of all social change. I'm not saying in any way, in anything actually that I talk about is that it is they are important, but it's not all, but it's not the only active ingredient here. The active ingredient here as well is some action. And with Black Lives Matter, when we begin to think about social innovation, we're actually disrupting like the logic at a cultural level. But then at the same time, you want to see something actually change. So things are different in 15 or 20 years from now. And that action is in fact actually defunding the actually police and working towards actually community-based actually policing model. If that does in fact go forward, then that would be an extensive social innovation that I don't think that we've seen actually something that large in Canada in actually recent years. Is that a question, Andrea, or?
No, I was suggesting when you made the comment that change, nothing much changes, I was suggesting that the deinstitutionalization of the mental health.
Oh yeah.
Something.
Yeah, and that did happen. I remember I was in Alberta in, I don't know, 10 plus years ago when they shut down all the psychiatric hospitals in the province. When the last one went, which is Micheal Center, up in Red Deer, Alberta, when they closed its doors in whatever, like 2008, 2009, I can't actually remember. They moved all actually mental health services to actually forensic units in the remand centers. So, you know, like it didn't change. And yeah, so I think that those are actually great points that we've like seen.
There's a comment about Holland Bloorview.
Okay.
That hospitals are moving more towards revenue generating. Clara, you can speak.
Hi, Mike.
Hi, nice. Clara. How are you?
I'm good. I'm really good. It was really refreshing to hear your presentation again. Just brought me back to the class around.
I know, you probably heard it all before.
It was still really great. No, I think what I was saying is I just couldn't agree more around the necessity to partner with the for-profit sector, because it's a reality at this point. And I work in the hospital sector, so I work at Holland Bloorview, and I'm a program manager for a program that is entirely funded by our foundation, which is donor dollars, right? So when you're talking about the community, or I guess what you would call the third sector in this case, is funding these programs and funds our entire research institute as well. And so that money is actually now even more reliable than government funding, which is steadily decreasing every single year, while we have to still find efficiencies. So what they call budget optimization every year, even as our volumes increase. And in addition to that, we've had to set up, I guess, fee for service programs. So revenue generating programs are around 35% of our revenue at this point. So I think it just speaks to the importance of shifting that way we think about how we advocate for our services. And every single year, I actually have to write a grant to the foundation for my own job and the jobs of my staff. So it's just such an interesting change in dynamic. It really is a reality now. And so having skills in that is really important.
Yeah, no, I think that's great, actually, Clara. Yeah, the point is like, is this ideal? Is this our ideal reality? No, I would never say that this is our ideal reality. It just is the reality that organizations are experiencing and causing us to think about actually new ways of doing these things. Like the University of Toronto, like runs like almost 2/3 of its annual actually revenue is actually market-based revenue. Fee for service from tuition, the third, and then a third comes from like its own investments and other things like its rental properties and things. Like only a third is actually direct actually government operating. So Hannah, do you have a question?
Yeah, so hi. And so kind of my question is kind of piggybacking off of that last part that you said. So obviously as social workers, I think the financial literacy part is a little like not there. So in terms of like investing in private equity, for example, like what I guess are some how to fill that knowledge gap, right? Or are you working on a team and stuff? So when you're thinking about like different ways of making money, that's really not something natural that would come to a social worker.
Yeah, it certainly is true. And like leaders I've talked to in the field over the years, one of the things they always say, the hardest thing that I've ever had to do is walk into a boardroom and ask for money, because they're not really taught how to do that. The one way, it's not that you have to do all of this stuff within, because you work in an organization, right? So the one thing is this, like the executive director of this organization who bought all these businesses, like the organization owns the businesses, right? There's nothing in Canada saying that nonprofits can't own businesses. Nonprofits all have, they have assets, right? You're allowed to own businesses. So he said the best thing that we ever did as an organization is we fired our fund developer and hired a business acquisitions officer. A lot of times in nonprofit organizations, fund developers don't even like bring in enough actually donations to cover their own salaries. And so we need to think about how our organizations are structured and if we're being surrounded by the people that have the knowledge that we need. Like, I don't know if there's any actually fund developers on the call here today. I'm sure you're doing a great job.
Thank you.
Terry, did you want to follow up on your comment, Terry? You're on mute, Terry.
Yes, thanks. I go back to a comment you made about, I think along the line that everyone can be a leader and that social work is just not a fixed role job, but leadership has to go beyond. Sometimes I think that we may have an inferiority complex as social workers, or just don't think that it's our job to do. And since many social workers are in clinical jobs, they don't get involved in these more macro issues, but everyone can be a leader, as you said. And I think I would love to see social work emerge more in leadership. In my experience, when I was in leadership, I wasn't seeing a lot of social workers. Mm-hmm. And I think it's undervaluing our backgrounds and potential. Do you have any comments on that?
Yeah, I certainly do. But like, I think one of the challenges is like, generally it's not within the field. Okay. So like there are opportunities in the field, and social workers who are interested in these sort of leadership roles, they end up finding like their way upwards within organizations. But it actually goes back further to education, and then what gets actually privileged within schools of social work in terms of what content that they're teaching to students. There aren't a lot of like management and leadership like programs at the graduate level in social work in Canada. I think I know of 3. McMaster has one. Calgary has one, we have one. So it's really, and each of the enrollment there is the smallest probably out of all of the students in the faculty, right? Like in our faculty, the overwhelming actually majority of students are in the health and mental health, the child welfare like fields. And so is it the student body like that's coming in and their interest? Or is it that at the, like when students get in there, are they not getting enough actually content or understanding about like what their role is as actually social welfare leaders in the field, which is fundamentally what social work is as an occupation. So I think that we do have to take a look at actually what we're teaching people. Like, are we adequately actually training MSW students to be able to actually engage in more actually leadership activities in the field? And right now in Canada, in social work, even in the United States, I don't think that we're doing a good enough job at that.
Well, I would think, Michael, that your kind of talk should probably be given to all the students in the School of Social Work, regardless of what discipline they're studying, just to help get their minds open into a bigger macro view of things.
Yeah, some of that does happen. It usually gets kind of fixed into like community development or something like that, but not necessarily specifically looking at like actually leadership of nonprofits. But yeah, I certainly agree with you, Terry. I think everyone should have to listen to me.
Mike, if I
Gotta
can
jump in. We've got 1 minute before 8. Is there anybody that would like to get a last word in? Anyone
I
that?
think Dexter says he'd like
yeah,
to.
if I
Yeah,
can
I'd like to
jump
get
in, jump in really quickly, you know, this talk was amazing, and this whole notion around propelling social workers to be leaders is something that we have taken on. So we've just got funded for a student leadership program within the faculty, and we're still in the early stages of figuring out what that would look like. But part of it is to select rising second-year students into this leadership fellowship program where they'll be matched with leaders, not only in the social service nonprofit sector, but across different disciplines. So like having mentors from law, from the business world, from the arts and culture world, so that they are mentored by these individuals during several touch points in a year. But then they also take a cluster of classes, maybe some of those classes that Michael and other folks are currently teaching, brown bags, to really start thinking of themselves as leaders. You know, there's a real sort of gender dynamic in social work, predominantly women. And then when you look at who is in the leadership roles in nonprofit agencies and social service agencies, although men are the minority group, they tend to more so move into leadership roles, right? So we want to start to inculcate in our students this sense of not just being a good team player and a supporting actor, but being a leader. And along those lines, we had Chancellor Patton this year speak to our incoming students about the importance of leadership. So this is a huge area, and Mike and others can help us to.
Thank you. Was it Alicia that wanted to make something quickly? Did you want to say
Yeah,
something?
I just wanted to say that I think we need to value money more. I think we need to value business acumen. I think one of the greatest things I ever did was go out and have to sell something to make money. And I don't think we sell the value of social work very well. Just a quick comment on leadership. Leadership is built into temperament. It's not just, and we can be leaders in our own way, but having worked in the field of assessing leadership, sales, and management, some people are natural at it, whether it's male or female, and they step to the front very quickly. Knowing yourself and awareness is really a big part of that. But I would really encourage people to have more affinity with business and being involved in that. Making money is a good thing. I'd like to make all of my staff a lot more wealthy for what they do. That's my piece.
Thank you. Thank you. Marissa had an interesting comment. It's a little too much for me to read it. Marissa, could you read it quick?
Oh, I think it's gone down on my chat, but it's just my experience working primarily in health is that, you know, other disciplines are much more queued up through their training, whether it's their learning competencies or what they experience in the field, to really translate their skills into leadership conversations from the word go. I think as social workers, we have those inherently built in. I would even argue into our temperament, but certainly into our training, but we're not as good as parlaying those into leadership competencies that matter for organizations. And I think there's much we can do to develop that as a group, which is great. This is a fantastic beginning, but I think there's a lot more we can do to demonstrate how triaging risk, having difficult conversations, managing conflict, those are all things that organizations are hungry for, and we do them well.
Thank you. Theo, I want to recognize you quickly because you're the only executive member that spoke up tonight. So go ahead, quick.
Yes, I just wanted to say that the leadership role in social work, sometimes you can get in the mindset to just jump into the working profession and just be boxed into your position and role. Several years back, I got into organizing a community advocacy group to just assist community members in Eglinton West. And it was more so just starting off with the groundwork of going into the community and getting some input as to what they were struggling with. Metrolinx was obviously building the LRT in the area. You noticed a lot of Black communities, I mean community business owners closing their business due to that. So our organization had to really just look at what our overall purpose and intention was. We wanted to definitely provide a voice for the community and not speak, on their behalf. So a lot of it required understanding, just the cultural landscape of the community and how to, preserve it. And 3 years later, we're a non-for-profit organization doing very well. We reached out to the MPPs that are in that riding area and community, and they actually approved Eglinton West to be officiated as Little Jamaica, which was one of our main initiatives. It's always been known as Little Jamaica growing up, but it was never officiated as Little Jamaica. And that's just one of a few things that we are seeing working out for us as an organization. Just wanted to add that to the conversation.
Case example. Very
Yeah,
good. Thank you.
No worries.
Just before we wrap up, I want to just remind everybody, November 16th, our next session, it's on the impact of COVID. We have speakers coming from 3 sectors. Please help me, Theo. One is Harbor Lights, addictions, and
Yes,
one is homeless youth from Covenant House, and the third one is long-term care. Long-term care, and that's for the November 16th session, impact of COVID. And then the latter part of November, we have a session on body-based intervention, and we'll be focusing on yoga. So just a little highlight, the promotion of all of these events for the year will be coming out so that you can mark your calendar, and I hope you can join us. I want to thank Micheal Shier very, very much. We're very grateful. You certainly have a following, and they definitely came out tonight. It was really great to have you, and I thank you very much for your willingness. Thank you. And Dexter, please, thank you very much. I want to thank you as well for joining us, for staying with us, and for all of the innovation that's coming. And everybody, I thank you so much for joining us, and we look forward to seeing you again. Have a good night. Thank you. Bye-bye.